How does a 20-year-old get well informed about their mental health?
Ultimately, it's relatively straightforward. The job of being in your 20s is about finding what you're passionate about in life, and it's getting socially connected to people. It's building the relationships that you're going to have for your lifetime.
What is depression exactly? What's happening when someone is diagnosed with depression?
We all know what sadness is like. We all know what it's like to be very sad. We all know what it's like to be anxious and worried about things. So clinical depression, usually defined by a cluster of experiences of symptoms that come with feeling very low, an absence of our ability to experience pleasure, maybe disruption of our ability to concentrate, to focus on things, to have energy and so forth.
People listening to this, I'm sure they've heard of depression, antidepressants, but I doubt many people would have heard about TMS. Would you talk a bit about what TMS exactly is? And we still are challenged by the inadequacies of the treatments that we have available for most mental health conditions, and depression falls into that category. In terms of standard antidepressant medications, not much has changed for 20 years. However, there has been continued work to try to develop alternative therapies, and TMS is one of those. TMS stands for Transcranial Magnetic Stimulation. It's really probably one of the leading lights. It's one of the most advanced of the, I suppose, new generation of treatments for depression. It's a very different treatment. For someone who's struggling in a quiet corner, is low and doesn't see what he can do to fix it or she can do to fix it, what would you say to them? What do you want them to hear?
One of the core symptoms of depression is hopelessness. People can't see a way forward. And the most important message that we can give anybody who's struggling with depression is a message of hope. There are lots and lots and lots of things that can help somebody who's depressed. And the first thing is just talking to anybody about that, to begin that journey towards getting that sort of help.
Paul, thank you for joining.
You're welcome.
Wonderful to have you. Paul, if you were 20 years old today, and what do you think would be the hardest part about staying mentally healthy?
Look, I think 20-year-olds in our community at the moment are in a pretty challenging position. They're at the lead of a generation that's growing up, that's had a very unusual set of circumstances that are resulting in much higher rates of mental health problems than we've really seen over previous decades. Those are things like the degree of exposure that people at that age group have had to various forms of social media. There's been changes in parenting patterns. There's really a whole range of societal trends that have come together to cause more problems of mental ill health in sort of people in their early 20s, late teenage years at the moment. So it's a big problem for them. And I think, my general advice is that individuals in that age group need to be very conscious of doing what they can do to support their well-being. We are so caught up in an online age at the moment. We're so focused on spending time on our phones, on our electronic devices, and those things can have some advantages. They can connect people socially, but they also have really significant disadvantages. People get disconnected from real friendships, being with people in person, being outside, engaging in real social activities, sporting teams, clubs, hobbies, all those sorts of things. And those things are really critical, important to sustaining our mental well-being. And so it's a real challenge for people in that age group.
So you mentioned being conscious about your mental health. How does a 20-year-old get well informed about their mental health and then try and be consciously behave or carry out their daily lives, so that their mental health is well kept?
I think there's a number of ways. There's lots of information out there about health and mental health and well-being, but ultimately it's relatively straightforward. The things that the job of being in your 20s is about finding what you're passionate about in life, and it's getting socially connected to people. It's building the relationships that you're going to have for your lifetime. Many of us at the latter stages of our life fall back on friendships that we form in our 20s. These are really critical parts of what it is to be a 20-year-old, and so being aware of the need to spend time investing in meaningful social relationships, not things that are mediated through comments on phones, but which occur in real life. The time you spend with people, they are really critical parts of not just your mental well-being when you're 20, but also about what's going to be important in your 20s and your 30s and your 40s and for the rest of your life, as is the pathway to understanding what it is that how you want to spend your life. And we talk a lot about passion, but that's about as much as finding what you're actually good at. You will become passionate and engaged in things that you get positive regard for. So, experimenting, looking around, exploring different things, and finding what you want to spend your time meaningfully doing, and which is going to support you and in the future potentially a family, is a critical thing. And that might be, it might take you several goes of exploring things to discover what you're really good at and what's going to, what you're going to dedicate your life to. But being a little bit brave and spending the time to do those things whilst you're also investing time in the social relationships that are going to support you is really critical, because it's through our social relationships that our mental well-being is most well supported.
So when I think about, let's say, a 20-year-old, 25-year-old young, how would they think about, I need to be connected socially, right? If I imagine when I was 20 years old, most of the time I think, you feel like you're immortal, you do, whatever you feel like. You rarely think about, I should make social connections. That's very important, right? Because you're so high in energy, right? You have your life ahead of you. You may have certain passions that you're pursuing, but as you said, having these social connections is extremely important. How does one realize that is important at that age?
Look, I think there's a couple of aspects of it. I think it is much harder now because people have become so attuned to mediating their social life online. Yeah. And the quality and the nature of the relationships we have with people through electronic devices is just not the same. There is a fundamental difference in the physiological and emotional reaction you have by being with people.
Yeah.
And so that requires conscious effort to actually put yourself out there in the world, whether you're 20 or whether you're 50. It requires conscious effort to put yourself out in the world and engage in things where you're going to meet and interact with people. And that might be, as I said, it might be through sporting activities, clubs, groups, hobbies, whatever it is. You have to make an effort to do that. And then whilst you're doing that, being consciously aware of the types of people you're interacting with, and what it is about individuals that you think is going to allow you to form meaningful relationships with those individuals. We think we think sometimes hard about the sorts of partners we might choose to spend our lives with, our romantic partners. We think perhaps a little bit less about the sorts of people we want to invest in as the friends that will be critical for us through our lives. And so, identifying people who have similar interests, but also characteristics and who we feel are likely to have the personal characteristics that are going to stick around when times are tough, not just be the fun people to be with at the, or be the life of the party is important considerations, but not things we tend to think about when we're at that age and stage of our lives.
Yeah. Social life has evolved quite a lot. It used to be a lot different, more digital social life these days. How has the field of psychiatry or mental health well-being, how has that evolved during your career? How do you see it has evolved over the years?
Look, I think the most profound change in the world of in the professional world of mental health is just that we're having these sorts of conversations. We weren't having these sorts of conversations 25, 30 years ago. There was a profound stigma around anything to do with mental ill health. And that has changed really substantially. And that is absolutely an extremely important and welcome change. That has meant that people are far more likely to talk about challenges that they have, come forward and try to access treatment, seek help, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, I think that's the upside. I think the negative side is that although some aspects of services and treatments and things that are available for people with mental health problems has improved, there have been new things developed and made available over that time, we are still a long, long way from where we should be. Systems of care are really broken in many ways, or just not adequate to meet the needs of the population of people with problems, and the treatments we have for people who require more, assertive, more active forms of mental health treatment. A lot of the treatments just aren't good enough, and so we've come a long way, but we've still got a very long way to go.
Right. It's interesting when social stigma, right? Thinking about when even I think about friends, some of the friends who used to have they're feeling low, they're anxious, or early depression, they'd share their story a lot less, but it's opened up quite a lot. Do you think that is because of why is that? I often wonder why is that the stigma has reduced over time, and is it because of, I don't know, digital means of sharing stories, or why do you think it is becoming more easier to share your story and not worry about whether it'll be socially accepted or looked down upon? What do you think that is now?
Look, I think it started with a very deliberate process. There was, starting really in the 1980s and into the early 1990s, a very deliberate attempt, particularly in Australia. Australia was a leading country in this space, but also in other places around the world. There were deliberate campaigns to try to reduce stigma, to start to have a dialogue around these sorts of issues. And fortunately, there were some prominent public figures in Australia and around the world who were just willing to start to come forward and to talk about their problems. I remember, locally when the first politicians and the first sports people who started to discuss mental health problems, it was a rarity. but the braveness of those sorts of individuals who started to come forward with their stories really did make a difference. I think that has been propagated over time through other forms of communication, including social media, where it's given people who are struggling ways of connecting to other individuals with mental health problems, with services and the like. But it really was there was some conscious and deliberate public health messaging, and really the efforts of brave individuals that started this off. Really.
Right. So when one saw someone else sharing their story,
absolutely,
strengthened to share theirs. Right.
Yeah. And if you see a public figure, someone you respect and look up to, and they're talking about having problems with depression, you start to think, well, geez, that's something I can talk to my family about, or my friends, or I can get help. It makes a big difference.
Wonderful. In terms of when someone is at that stage where they're now open to share their story, in terms of assistance, help, or treatment, could you paint a broad picture of what are their options, right? So when, for example, let's say if I start sharing my story that I'm feeling low or unhappy about after a broken relationship, etc., what are my options? Right?
So generally speaking, there are lots of options, and I think that's the most important thing. That I think, as we've probably already given the message, the first and most important thing is being able to talk about these things, and that might be just starting to talk to somebody who cares for you and who you care for about it, so that you feel like you have some degree of support and somebody's got your back. And so whether that's a family member or a close friend, that's kind of a critical first step. Probably beyond there, the most generic mechanism of connection to services that's likely to apply across places and countries and so forth is through a family doctor. All around the world, in most countries, family doctors will be aware of the services available within somebody's local community. There are, in different countries, lots of other early intervention programs and public health services for individuals with mental health challenges. But as I said, by far and away, the most universal point of first access is through a GP or a family doctor.
Right. And then then the GP decides at what stage this person needs care?
Really the first decision point is this just, is the person just experiencing distress which is in the normal range of being, or is this something that warrants some more sort of active intervention? There is always a danger here that, the flip side, the downside of us being far more aware of mental health problems is a danger that we over-medicalise normal experience and distress. What we really don't want is somebody who is experiencing, a genuine, normal emotional reaction to a difficult life circumstance to have that labelled as and described within sort of pathological terms,
right? A condition,
and there is if in some Western contexts now, there's a real trend towards describing and perceiving difficult life circumstances in the language of trauma.
Right.
And it's important for people who really have serious psychological reactions to traumatic life events to get help. But it can also be somewhat unhelpful to perceive difficult life experiences as trauma. And the reason why that is that your likely psychological reaction, if you think you have been traumatized, is to think you need some form of treatment.
Right.
And if that's not necessarily the case, if this is, that's going to take you away from the sorts of things that are genuinely going to be helpful for you. The way we have always dealt with difficult life experiences is in a social context. We go to our peers, we talk to our friends, we talk to our family. We discover that the sorts of experiences that we've had are relatively normal. We've been through a relationship breakup. We're feeling horrible. We talk to our friends and family members about it, and they describe similar experiences that they have had. We realise that this is a normal part of human experience. We learn from our friends what they did to help overcome those circumstances, and we find our pathway forward. So, but going back to your question, that's really the first critical matter. Is this something that warrants further intervention? Do I need to, speak to a psychologist, a counsellor? Am I at the point where I've got some, require some more serious intervention like medication or the like, or is this something that fits more within somebody's normal range of experience?
Right. How does one identify this situation? So, for example, if the situation that I described earlier, let's say if I have a test, or I'm going to play a game that I'm anxious about its result and stuff like that, right? That's normal. But depending on how affected you are because of that, you might not feel that it is normal, as you said, right? You might feel that you need help. So, as you said, the first solution or first thing to do is to communicate with your peers, your family, and then you're hearing similar stories, right? I'm thinking about, you're hearing similar stories that, this person also went through the same. That's normal. It's not something that needs professional help, right? But then, how does one identify? So let's take a case. For example, in professional thinking, depression. What is depression exactly? What's happening when someone is diagnosed with depression?
So it's important to start with the observation, really, that most mental health problems sit on a spectrum of normality. So we all know what sadness is like. We all know what it's like to be very sad. We all know what it's like to be anxious and worried about things. Clinical depression or clinical anxiety are really are on that spectrum, but are characterised by severity and persistence, and the degree to which they impair our ability to function in our daily tasks. Right. So clinical depression is usually defined by a cluster of experiences of symptoms that come with feeling very low, an absence of our ability to experience pleasure, maybe disruption of our ability to concentrate, to focus on things, to have energy, and so forth. Where that meets clinical criteria is really on how severe those symptoms are, how long they've lasted for. This is something that's been there for weeks or months, not just for a few hours or for a few days, and that's starting to impair our ability to function. Maybe we can't get out of bed in the morning and get to work, or we're not able to study or help look after our family. So it's a constellation of severity, time and persistence of symptoms, and their impact on our daily life.
Right. And what's happening in the brain itself at that time?
That's a really good question, and it's still a question, despite many decades of research, we can't fully answer. There was a belief propagated for many decades that depression itself was characterized by changes in particular chemicals in the brain. Mm-hmm. The main theory that was proposed to explain depression there was a reduction in the functioning of a particular neurochemical called serotonin. We have pretty much disproved that notion. Did a long time ago, actually. That idea was a very convenient truth for the pharmaceutical industry, who were producing drugs that increased serotonin levels. And so it was a nice myth to say, well, you've not got enough serotonin, take our drug and that will fix that problem and you'll be fine. Mm-hmm. The reality is it's just not true. Those drugs do work through increasing serotonin levels, but there's no real clear evidence that serotonin is reduced in the brain in people who are depressed. What we do know about the brain in depression is, the brain's a very complex organ. And the way the brain functions to underpin the sort of major cognitive functions and emotions is through complex networks where multiple regions in the brain interact with one another in sort of complex ways. And we see those complex interactions disrupted in people who are depressed. We see certain networks and parts of the brain that are overactive, often the areas of the brain that are associated with internally focused thoughts.
Right.
So there's a particular network in the brain that's often referred to as the default mode network. It's a particular area of the brain that tends to be active when you're in your own headspace. And people with depression tend to spend a lot of time in their own headspace. They're often ruminating and thinking very negative, self-focused thoughts. On the other hand, areas of the brain that tend to be activated when we're engaged in very active cognitive thought, purposeful cognitive thought, tend to be underactive in people with depression. And there tends to be a failure to if we want to try to concentrate on something, to do something effortfully, we tend to fail to turn on those areas in the way we should and to switch off that self-focused thought. So there's these complex interactions between different regions in the brain that seem to underpin depression, but what the fundamental underpinnings of that is, of those networks and how they interact with one another, we're still trying to understand that now.
Is there a balanced state that's supposed to be from which this network moves away?
I think probably the best way to say it is that there's probably a greater degree of flexibility in the normally functioning brain, in that we're able to move between the networks that underpin the type of function that should be active depending on the circumstances that we're in, than is the case when somebody's depressed. There's almost a greater degree of stuckness of those networks.
I see.
And less flexibility would probably be a reasonable way of describing it.
I see, yeah.
I suppose the other thing I would say about trying to understand depression is, we spent many, many decades talking about differences between so-called reactive depression or endogenous depression. Psychiatry used to be totally preoccupied between whether your depression was reactive, in other words, it was occurring in the context of some social stressor, or whether it was endogenous or biological. In other words, you got it through your genes and it was just happening despite what your world was doing to you.
I see. So some people are predisposed genetically.
Well, this distinction, as I said, we were focused on for many, many decades. It doesn't really hold out.
Oh, really?
There is probably, there does seem to be some genetic predisposition. If depression runs in your family, you're more likely to have depression than somebody who doesn't have that predisposition. But that genetic contribution seems to be a very small one. And if we look at the significance of life events, so things that, traumas, difficult things in your life, and whether they precede episodes of depression, we find something really interesting. What we see is, if you look at somebody who becomes depressed for the first time, they're much more likely to have experienced something really difficult in their life beforehand. There's a much higher rate of episodes of depression being triggered by something that's going on that's difficult, maybe a divorce, or being traumatized in some way, a relationship breakup. However, if you look further, depression tends to be a relapsing condition. If someone gets better, it's likely to come back. If you look at somebody who's having a third or a fourth or a seventh episode of depression, and you look at whether they're more likely to have had a difficult life event before those episodes, you don't see that same pattern. So what this all says to me is, it's both reactive and it's endogenous. What tends to happen is that first episode is much more likely to be in response to life events, but then something changes in our brain that we become vulnerable to having further episodes later in our life that may then occur without those same sorts of triggers. So it's not is it one or the other? It's probably both. It differs across your lifespan and the circumstances that you're in.
It almost sounds like there's a network that learns that this is what...
It gets embedded in some way. Yeah.
It does. Do we know that it does?
We don't know what that is, but I think that's probably a reasonable way of describing it. And we desperately need to understand those processes better.
In early stages of life, the less adverse experiences one has, the less likely they would be to have these sort of conditions later on in the life.
Look, I think that's a reasonable assumption. Certainly, there are very high rates of adverse life experiences that occur in the early life of people who go on to develop depression, but also which occur, prior to those first initial episodes.
And you mentioned our understanding of what depression itself is used to be different, right? So that also would, in that case, mean that the way medications were prescribed, it's a different picture now. There are a lot more alternative techniques. One that you've pioneered in a way, TMS. People listening to this, I'm sure they've heard of depression, antidepressants, but I doubt many people would have heard about TMS. Would you talk a bit about what TMS exactly is and how does it help in different conditions?
We still are challenged by the inadequacies of the treatments that we have available for most mental health conditions, and depression falls into that category. In terms of standard antidepressant medications, not much has changed for 20 years. However, there has been continued work to try to develop alternative therapies, and TMS is one of those. It's really probably one of the leading lights. It's one of the most advanced of the, I suppose, new generation of treatments for depression. It's a very different treatment. So TMS stands for Transcranial Magnetic Stimulation. It's not putting a magnetic band under your pillow or wearing something on your wrist. It's a medical device that where basically a machine is connected to a coil, which is this sort of plastic coated thing that looks like the top of a very large key that sits just resting on your scalp. The machine generates quite a strong electrical current which passes through that coil, but there's no contact of that electricity with the body. What happens is that the switching on and off of that electrical current generates a strong magnetic field. Magnetic fields pass through us without any resistance. That's why we can have an MRI scan that's basically uses a magnetic field. But when that magnetic field goes into the brain, by Faraday's law, if we apply a strong magnetic field to something that conducts electricity, we can generate an electrical current. And our brains are full of things that conduct electricity, the nerve cells in our brain. And so it's kind of a trick. There's electricity in the coil, this magnetic field goes into the brain, and then we get the induction of an electrical current in the brain. So we've got it in there without actually having to directly stimulate the head or the person themselves. And what happens then is if that magnetic field is focused enough and it's in the right place, it can make nerve cells fire in the brain. So the simplest example of this, if you put the coil over the area of the brain that controls the muscles in your hand, it makes those nerve cells fire and it sends a signal down to cause a muscle twitch, which is a little bit bizarre when you first experience it because you can't control it. You feel this sort of tap on your head and your hand jumps and you think, what's going on? When we apply TMS as a treatment for depression, what we do is we apply many of those pulses, and I'm talking tens of thousands of those pulses across a series of treatments. In a standard course of TMS, somebody might come into the clinic on a daily basis for 4 to 6 weeks, and they have a treatment that can last anywhere from a couple of minutes to maybe half an hour. And they get lots of these pulses. And essentially what we're doing is we're making a big bunch of nerve cells, usually at the front of the brain, most commonly on the left. We make them fire repeatedly over time. And the brain in many ways sort of works on a use it or lose it principle. You know, the circuits or the networks that are most active tend to get reinforced. Mm-hmm. So these nerve cells tend to project down into deeper parts of the brain, and we're strengthening some of that circuitry. And this is actually the more cognitive parts of the depression circuit, the bits of the brain that are involved in depression. What we're probably doing is we're restoring the capacity of these cognitive or thinking parts of the brain to then control other parts of the brain and helping rebalance some of those networks that we talked about earlier on, and then hopefully getting therapeutic benefit. Fortunately, it works. It's a sort of an unusual treatment, but it works in a very significant percentage of patients. It's very safe. It's extremely well tolerated. Patients after their daily treatment sort of walk out and can drive home, get back on with their day in most cases, and it's quite successful.
I'm interested. How did it come about? Did we the science of it itself from medications to this?
And interestingly, almost all treatments that we use in psychiatry in some way were kind of incidentally discovered.
Okay.
But this was one example where there was some considered thought. So back in the first TMS machines were invented back in the mid-1980s, and they weren't invented with any intention to do anything like this. They were actually invented, going back to my example earlier on about inducing a muscle twitch, mm-hmm. to allow people to study the flow of electricity from the brain down into the nervous system. Within a few years, people started to discover if the effects of repeatedly stimulating, providing multiple pulses over time, they discovered that particular frequencies of stimulation would increase brain activity. In the late 80s, early 90s was the time when the first brain imaging studies were starting to be done of things like depression. And the first brain imaging studies in depression was showing a reduction in blood flow or reduction in metabolic activity in the left frontal part of the brain. And so some clever people put these two observations together, that there was this reduction in activity and potentially this technique that might increase activity in the brain if you repeatedly stimulated it at certain frequencies. So I thought, well, let's apply that stimulation to this frontal part of the brain and see if it works. Mm-hmm. The initial clinical trials were very short. They were very low dose compared to what we do now because there were lots of concerns about safety. It was a new technique. But they were obviously just dosed high enough to get a signal. Some people got better and everyone got very excited. There was a sort of a flurry of activity, and the field sort of went through some ups and downs, but it's, progressed to the point where we are now, where it's now a very commonly available treatment.
And it helps in most of the conditions, or is it higher sort of in terms of effectiveness in a particular condition?
The most common and best proven application for TMS is in clinical depression. Right. That's where it's approved and clinically available in many, many countries. There has been research exploring the use of TMS in just about anything else that you can think of that involves the brain. Pretty much all mental health conditions, a lot of neurological conditions. And so we've got a range of evidence from some conditions which are now transitioning into clinical use. So obsessive compulsive disorder, which mm-hmm. is a relatively common mental health condition which affects about 1% to 2% of the population. There's pretty good evidence that TMS is effective for OCD, and it's approved in the US and being used in a number of countries for OCD. There's reasonable evidence that it might help people with things like post-traumatic stress disorder, mm-hmm. Some forms of substance dependence and addiction. In fact, it's approved in the US for to help people with smoking cessation. And there's also, interestingly, been a lot of research exploring the use of TMS for patients with various chronic pain conditions. Again, like addiction, it's a complex area because there's lots of different sorts of chronic pain, there's lots of different addictions, there's different potential targets in the brain. And so that in both of those areas, we haven't coalesced yet around one particular, the best way of doing treatment. And so it hasn't necessarily translated as much into clinical practice as it has, for example, in depression. But there's still a lot of research going on in some of those areas.
That's very interesting. And it's completely non-invasive.
It's certainly non-invasive. It's not without side effects. It's very safe. There is a very, very slight risk of it triggering a seizure like somebody with epilepsy would have, because we're making the brain more active.
Right.
And if we overdo that, we can trigger a seizure, but fortunately they're just very rare. The most common problem with TMS is that as the magnetic field goes into the brain, it also stimulates the nerves and muscles in the scalp. And somewhere between 1% and 5% of people, depending on the protocol that's being used, just find that quite uncomfortable, if not painful. It's like the best analogy is having a little woodpecker sitting there banging away on your head. The protocols we used to use, a standard treatment protocol, went for almost 40 minutes. We now have protocols which get just the same therapeutic benefit, but which are over and done with in less than 5 minutes.
Right.
They tend to be a bit more intense, but most patients tend to prefer them because they're over and done with a lot quicker. But some patients will walk out after a treatment and they're feeling headachy or a bit, dazed, but most people tolerate it perfectly fine.
It doesn't need, so a session of treatment, does it need preparations in advance, or so a patient comes in, what's the process like?
Usually what happens is before somebody has a course of treatment, there's a series of procedures done to work out how high the machine needs to be turned up and to locate where the coil needs to sit, but that's relatively straightforward. A normal treatment, somebody will come in, sit in the chair, it might take the operator a couple of minutes just to set the machine up, and then away they go. It's pretty straightforward. There are interestingly some applications, including the one in obsessive compulsive disorder, where there seems to be benefit if we can do things to change the brain state at the time of treatment. So what that actually involves in the treatment of obsessive compulsive disorder is before someone has their course of TMS treatment, they sit down with a therapist and they work out a script. And this script is something that the treater can do to actually bring on their symptoms to a certain level. We don't want to make them so uncomfortable they're going to leave the room and not have treatment. But the idea is to bring on their symptoms. So it might be, say, for example, somebody who has obsessive worries about contamination. It might be writing out something that the treater will read out about, I want you to sit there and imagine that you're about to touch a dirty tissue. Mm-hmm. And so what will happen then when the patient comes in for their daily treatment, they'll sit down, the treater will read that script, induce those symptoms, and then as soon as the person's starting to feel their symptoms coming on, they'll start the machine and run the treatment whilst their brain is in the state of those symptoms. And the notion there is that we're trying to actually directly interact with that, disrupt that brain circuitry that's underpinned the therapy. But that's unusual. That's in the OCD context. With depression, it's usually done with the person just resting quietly in the chair.
What's the efficacy like? So in terms of percentages, what is it like?
So standard TMS, the sorts of figures that we see in standard clinical practice is somewhere between 40 to 50% of patients will get a very good clinical response. Okay. The depression will go away, go into remission. Maybe another 10, 20% of patients get benefit without it really being life-changing, and about a third of patients it doesn't work for. It's important to put that in context. These tend to be patients who have tried other antidepressant treatments already. Mm-hmm. So we will have patients who've tried 2 antidepressants. They might have tried 5, 6, 7. They've had counselling, psychotherapy, etc. And in that context, the likelihood that they would respond to another treatment, particularly a medication, is very, very low.
Right.
So the chances of TMS working in that context is certainly better than it is with other treatments.
Right.
In terms of commercialisation and availability, it does vary a lot where you are in the world.
Of course.
There are lots of countries now where TMS clinics have become quite popular. Certainly here in Australia, there are TMS clinics in all of the major urban centres, a lot of rural, rural cities, outer suburban places, and so forth, and that reflects what's happening in other countries as well. TMS is subsidised through funding programs. In the US, most private insurers will fund the availability of TMS. Here in Australia, it's funded through Medicare. Through a major health funding provider. So that does vary a little bit between country and place.
What are the major hurdles you think in making this treatment as common as antidepressants?
The major problem with TMS is not its efficacy, it's not its side effects, it's convenience.
Right.
A standard course of TMS, as I've already alluded to, involves coming into a clinic, even if it's only for 10, 15 minutes, on a daily basis over numerous weeks. And that just is difficult for people. They have to they've got work commitments, family commitments. They might live in a rural or remote area where clinics aren't available to them. So that is the biggest challenge.
I see.
There's a variety of ways we're trying to address that challenge. One of those ways, and I suppose a related problem, is that it takes time. And so, people who are having a course of treatment who get better usually don't feel a great deal of improvement for the first couple of weeks. It's usually around the 2-week mark that their mood starts to pick up. But, they're going to be having to front up for treatment for a couple of weeks before that really starts to kick in. One of the ways we're trying to address that is our research group, but others around the world as well, have been working for about, the last 10 years or so on developing what are called accelerated protocols. The idea here is instead of coming in for a short period of time for many, many weeks, you might come in for a much shorter number of days, but you have a much higher dose or more treatments on those days. So you might just have a week's worth of treatment, but you might have 5, 6, up to 10 treatments on each of those days. And we now know that we can do some of these accelerated protocols and get the same degree of efficacy.
Okay.
And some of them look like we're getting as good, if not greater degrees of efficacy, and we're getting patients better quicker. So, if you live in a remote country region, maybe all you have to do is come down to the city, stay in a hotel or with a friend, family, or even in hospital and have an intensive burst of treatment. That might be a more practical way than having to, try to navigate 6 weeks of therapy. So these accelerated protocols are starting now to transition into clinical practice. There's been a lot of research done in the clinical trials we've run. We've had well over 500 patients through a series of clinical trials, and we've seen that treatment is as good as standard treatment. We'd like it to be even better, and that's a focus of ongoing research around the world. But that's making it more practically available to a lot of people, which is great.
How big are these machines? So what I'm thinking is that when you have an antidepressant prescription, you take it home and you follow the prescription, right? So it's prescribed DIY at home, right? Thinking of a similar situation, could we in future be at that stage where it's small enough?
Yep.
Take it home, your prescription, or you've been given a prescription, just put it like a, headphone or, any progress, any thoughts? What's the current state? How big is the machine, and how smaller can we make it?
Yeah. TMS machines are relatively large boxes that are full of a lot of what we call capacitors, which are the electronic components that store the electricity so that they can be released very quickly. And the coils that sit on the head are quite chunky, and you have these big stands that hold them. All of that technology is being improved on, and there are several companies around the world working on developing sort of portable or small enough TMS devices that could be used at home. Okay. I think some of the technology is advanced that you can, probably get the capacitors down into something that, is probably the size of a briefcase.
Okay.
What's harder is to develop a cap type structure that really comfortably ensures that the coil sits in the right place without an external stand and external supervision. I think it's doable, and we're getting there. And as I said, there are companies working on those sorts of solutions at the moment. The other thing that's happening is that there is a whole range of other technologies that are being developed for other forms of non-invasive ways of trying to stimulate brain activity with different forms of technologies. And so one of those around which there's been an enormous amount of excitement is a thing called transcranial direct current stimulation, which is really simple technology. It literally is applying a direct electrical current through a couple of electrodes on the scalp. These are relatively weak currents. You feel a sort of tingle, but you don't get an electric shock or anything like that. And there's been a lot of research with this technique. It's known as TDCS. And TDCS has some antidepressant properties. They probably don't seem as strong as those with TMS, but it is being used in some contexts in the treatment of depression. But there are other things being developed as well to sort of personalize these forms of stimulation. There's another technique called alternating current stimulation, which our research group's quite excited about. And these technologies are very much things that could be built into caps and people could take home. So we've run a number of clinical trials testing this TACS technology. We've run those in people with depression who've done it at home. We've done it in young people with depression because we thought, young people are perhaps a little bit more tech savvy, but they're also a little bit less reliable, teenagers. So we found that they were very able to apply treatment at home. But we also did it at the other end of the age. We've run clinical trials in people with mild cognitive impairment in the early stages of dementia. And generally speaking, somebody would have a family member assisting in applying the treatment, but that again was very practical and possible to do. So we're excited about the potential of some of these new technologies as well to help patients in the future.
I've been thinking since the time you've said that TMS also affects limb finger movement. Has there been companies or is there some work where TMS is being used as performance enhancement in healthy individuals?
To any substantial degree, there has certainly been and mainly that's the practical aspect of the type of technology and so forth. There is certainly, it's probably now about between 10 and 15 years ago, there was a lot of interest in the potential use of TDCS, the electrical stimulation I was describing, to be used for cognitive enhancement or
Focus,
sport performance. And there were a couple of companies that launched around those times and a lot of excitement. One of the challenges. Firstly, I think, as I said, TDCS is probably a little bit weaker in its overall effects than TMS. But the brain is an extraordinary organ in the sense that if you try to augment normal function, it's actually quite hard. The brain is what I describe as a very strong homeostatic response. And so there's quite a lot of experiments that have been done with TMS and TDCS, a lot of these technologies. If you apply them in the healthy brain, you can get some enhancement of function. But if, say, for example, you double the dose, you don't get a doubling effects. What often you see is the effects go back to baseline. It's very and I think what that reflects is the brain just basically pushes back against things that are designed to disrupt what it sees as the normal balance. And so if you're applying stimulation to somebody who has a condition of the brain where there's an abnormality, you'll often see a dose effect. The higher dose you apply, the greater the effects.
Perfect.
You don't see those dose responses in somebody who's got who's got a normal brain state because of this homeostatic response. So I think there's also some intrinsic barriers to using these technologies to enhance normal function. And there's also a question about, if you enhance function in one domain, is that then at the expense of some other domain?
Right.
And we just don't know. There was one experiment quite a number of years ago that showed you could use a particular type of brain stimulation to enhance a particular type of mathematical performance. But there was a sort of almost like a complementary other aspect of mathematical thinking that actually went down when one went up. And it was a bit like, well, you're just getting a trade-off in resources here. You're channeling the brain's metabolism towards one network or one circuit at the cost of something else. And so that's a real challenge.
It was in a similar function. So you mentioned that a certain way of mathematical function of the brain increased, but similar.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact details of the experiment. This was quite a lot. This was at least 10 years ago, but it was sufficiently. The theoretical construct of the people who did the experiment, which made some sense, was that the other function was requiring in a sense, a different pathway of manipulation. It was sufficiently different that it was complementary, but also complementary in that requiring, a different set of circuitry.
Right.
I think, and I'm generalizing here from a fairly distant memory, where we're talking about something that was far more about a gestalt or requiring an integration of a whole range of information rather than something that was a very specific, focused cognitive task,
right.
Where the latter was being enhanced, but that was at the cost of the former.
Yeah. Interesting. Brain, you mentioned the homeostatic function of the brain, that there is some sort of a upper limit that it tries to maintain. But then when and you've done quite a bit of work in psychedelics as well. When you see the effect of psychedelics, it's just in certain cases, it just takes you in completely different aspects of how your brain functions, right? How does, and of course there are lots of ancient stories I've heard from different parts of the world of use of psychedelics and how that affects your brain. In terms of treatment, how does that it's now growing all over the world. What's the story there?
So the idea of using psychedelic medications like LSD originally, psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, or MDMA. Which is a component of ecstasy. This is not a new idea. There was a lot of thought being given to this back in the 1960s. Some of these drugs were being synthesized in the late 50s and so forth. And the idea was that you could potentially enhance the process of psychotherapy, that somebody might be engaged in psychotherapy trying to understand and explore the challenges of their life, and might become stuck and have a trouble working through the issues that they're facing, and that by having a psychedelic medication experience, that could in a sense open the doors, give them a different way of seeing things, or enable them to approach and think about their trauma in a different way. Clearly, the vast majority of that research and focus was squashed when the war on drugs began around the world, and it's only been the last decade or so that this whole field has been sort of reinvigorated, and it's been reinvigorated all around the world with a lot of research, a lot of commercial interest, a lot of scientific interest. The two leading applications that have been developed the most through clinical trials have been the use of psilocybin as a treatment for patients with severe depression or persistent depression, and the use of MDMA in the treatment of people with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. In both of those cases, there have been quite a number of clinical trials done around the world, and in both areas, those clinical trials look quite promising.
Okay.
The biggest challenge in this whole in the field has been around trying to understand what is the evidence that we are going to need to make a decision that these are the sorts of treatments that should become available in clinical practice. And one of the biggest issues here is that the standard approach to assessing any form of new therapy, which is a placebo-controlled clinical trial, is problematic in this context. And by what I mean by that is, if I want to do a clinical trial of psilocybin, the whole notion of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is it's not just taking a drug like you would have taking an antidepressant drug, but that drug is embedded in a therapeutic framework. Mm-hmm. And so what would happen in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is the person would sit down with one or two therapists for a number of sessions beforehand to understand what their problems are, to prepare them for these medication sessions. Then on a medication session day, they would take a dose of drugs, and they would be in a room, usually with two therapists, for pretty much a full day. It takes that time for the effects of the medication to work, but then also to wear off. They'd have an experience guided and supported by those therapists. They might repeat that dosing a couple of times, but critically afterwards, they would continue a therapeutic journey where they would be exploring the meaning of what they experienced during that day and talking about that and trying to understand it and think about how that might change their understanding of their symptoms and so forth to achieve therapeutic benefit. Now, all of that is very difficult to replicate in a placebo-controlled trial. You really need to do all of those things, but instead of giving the psilocybin, give the person a placebo. The problem is when they have the placebo and then an hour later they're sitting there in the room, and instead of having a profound change in their conscious state as they would on the active drug, they're completely in their normal state. The majority of people realise that they're not having the active drug.
Right.
And so there's been a lot of scepticism about these clinical trials and about, is this just a really powerful placebo or is there a genuine effect? And that's where the field is at the moment. We've got very promising results from clinical trials and a lot of people who are convinced that these are effective drugs and should be made very widely available. And on the other hand, a lot of the sort of psychiatric orthodox establishment who are very skeptical and say, well, it's just all a placebo and we shouldn't approve these treatments. And this poses a real challenge because there are some groups, including our own, where we're trying to do better placebos, use other substances to produce some changes in brain function that might, help us tease these things out. But I don't think we're going to get a perfect, purely blindable clinical trial. And so we probably need to gather information from a variety of sources to ultimately come to a conclusion. So in Australia, the federal government, after a lot of lobbying, has instituted a scheme where patients can get access to both of the two treatments, psilocybin treatment for depression or MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder, under very tightly regulated conditions. There's only there's probably no more than 15 or 20 psychiatrists around Australia who've been approved to do this treatment. They have to have very tightly, closely approved protocols. And we've established a registry where we're hoping as many of those doctors as possible will enrol their patients in the registry when they participate in this treatment, so we can get substantive real-world data.
Right.
So that ultimately we can take the results of the clinical trials, but we can also look at real-world data. If this is, if something's a powerful placebo effect, people might feel better for a while, but it doesn't change their life in the long term. So what we want to look at is what's the experience of people 12 months later like, 18 months later like, what are the long-term effects? If we can show that these medications are producing very meaningful and very persistent benefits, then that will be really supportive evidence that these treatments should become more widely available in the future.
These psychedelic assisted treatments, are they independent of any other treatment, or they're done? So, for example, TMS and antidepressant medication. Is there a combination of all of them, or this can be done independently of any other treatment available?
They're tending to be done in people who have had other treatments and those other treatments haven't worked.
Okay.
They tend to be done independently. But I would say one very critical thing here. Some of the hype around these medications and some of the commercial development has almost proposed that they are a standalone time-limited treatment. In other words, you can be referred to a clinic for psychedelic therapy, you have your 1, 2 or 3 dosing sessions and a little bit of therapy afterwards to integrate your experience, and then you'll be fine. I think there are 2 problems with that. One is we don't have good data on what the long-term effects of these medications are. Are you going to need further treatment down the track? We just don't know. Mm-hmm. But more importantly, I think, what we're already starting to understand is that model might work well for some people, but it's not going to work well for everybody. Mm-hmm. And I think PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, is a perfect example here. Mm-hmm. There are some people who develop PTSD because they've had one really difficult life experience. Maybe they were involved in a severe motor car accident, mm-hmm. or they were assaulted, or they were experienced a burglary of their house and were extremely frightened. Under those circumstances, it is feasible to me that a time-limited period of psychedelic therapy where they work through that trauma and overcome that trauma may well be very effective, and they may then will be able to get on with the rest of their life. The reality, though, is the majority of people who have post-traumatic stress disorder have experienced multiple traumas during their adult life and often during their earlier life as well. If you have a really difficult childhood, you've been subject to physical abuse or neglect, you are much more likely when life goes wrong in adulthood to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. I think it's far less realistic to expect that a time-limited period of treatment is going to resolve all of those sorts of problems. Mm-hmm. And so I think for a lot of people, these therapies are going to be part of a therapeutic journey. It might help, again, sort of open the door for them to continue to have therapy afterwards. But I think, I suspect the majority of people having psychedelic therapy, it's going to be part of a long-term therapeutic journey, not something that's just nice and neatly packaged up, and you can then sort of expect to get on with your life.
Are we, as psychiatrists, are you able to predict, depending on the severity of a condition, how long it'll take to fix the right word? Because I'm thinking about predictions. You mentioned data registry, right? We are seeing AI predicting quite a lot of things these days, cancer out of images and so on. As a human psychiatrist, do we predict how accurate they are? And if they are, that's great. And then can AI help in that situation? So I'll say a couple of things. I think as clinicians, we're not great at predicting these sorts of things. And a lot of treatment choice historically in psychiatry has been try it and see. We'll try this medication. There might be some vague idea that your family member responded to this class of medication, so I'm going to try that class of medication in you. But generally speaking, it's much more of a try and see approach. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of research exploring whether there are clinical characteristics, the severity of depression, the type of symptoms, et cetera, that whether they predict response to these sorts of treatments. We've done a lot of that research with TMS. Can we understand a clinical type of patient that's going to do better? And in reality, we just haven't got to that point. It hasn't been successful. What we've shifted our focus towards is, are there neuroscience tools that we can use to predict response to treatment? And so one of the ones we've done a lot of research with is a thing called EEG, or electroencephalography, where we measure the electrical activity in the brain. Mm-hmm. We then give a course of treatment, whether that's TMS or some other therapy.
and then look at whether those EEG patterns can predict response to treatment.
Right.
And the EEG data is complex data, and so we use forms of machine learning or artificial intelligence to interrogate that data. And it's starting to get pretty good. We're starting to get pretty good rates of being able to say this treatment is going to work or it's not going to work in an individual patient. But that's actually not the right question. Okay. That's what we and everybody else have asked historically. Mm-hmm. The better question to ask is, can we do an EEG and have the machine learning or the artificial intelligence tell us not is one treatment going to work or not? It should be to say which of a number of treatments is the best treatment to try. And then and give us a gradation of, the most likely effective treatment is X. Maybe it's TMS, or maybe it's medication, or maybe it's psychedelic therapy. And then the next one, and the next one, the next one. So in other words, what we need these tools to do is to inform treatment choice. Mm-hmm. A patient doesn't want to know, is this going to work or not work? Well, if it was black and white, yes. But if it's saying you've got a 50% chance of it working or a 30% chance of it working, that's not that helpful. What we really need is the tools to say, this is the best treatment for you. And those sorts of studies examining lots of different treatments, they haven't really been done well enough yet. And that's part of the research that we're going to be trying to do over the coming years. Look at multiple different sorts of treatments and then see if the artificial intelligence can choose which one is going to be the most effective based on data like the EEG data.
Is it that black and white, that there is one treatment that'll be more effective?
It may not be. We don't know. We haven't done all the analyses that have tended to have been done so far. All the studies have tended to focused on one treatment. So we've analysed, can this model predict whether TMS is going to work, or does this model predict whether medication is going to work? But they haven't looked at multiple different sorts of treatment in the same sets of patients. It might be that the model says that 3 treatments are all equally effective for you, and there might be another patient where no treatment's effective, but we don't understand those patterns because that type of research looking across different treatments just hasn't been done sufficiently well yet.
Yourself, a clinician, how do you look at it? Do you look at combination of treatments that'll bring out maximum effect, or do you think, this one treatment would have maximum benefit for this particular patient?
It's often a combination, and it is almost always a discussion of effectiveness, side effects, and that question of convenience that we talked about earlier on. So I will always have a conversation with a patient where we explore all of those things. But when I say it's a combination, for a significant percent of, once a patient's come to me as a psychiatrist, they've usually had some form of psychological treatment. And so it's unlikely that the answer is going to be a singular psychological treatment. Right. And so we're going to be talking about different types of biological or physical treatments. But the combination is that it is still going to involve some sort of psychological treatment as well. Mm-hmm. Because even if the biological treatment is very effective, somebody comes in and has a wonderfully effective response to TMS, for example, they get 100% better. I know that one of the most effective things that person can do in the future to stop their depression coming back again is a thing called mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which is a type of psychological intervention. Right. It doesn't matter that it was TMS that got them better in the first place, or medication, some physical treatment. There is a psychological intervention that is going to improve their quality of life in the long term by reducing the likelihood of the depression coming back again. Now, psychological therapy mightn't have got them better, but it can help them stay well. And so it's often a combination, but it might be a combination of different therapies at a different point in time to suit where that person is in their journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. While you mentioned talk therapy, I was thinking, a few years ago, chatbots started to come in and replaced customer service calls, right? We now chat more than we talk. Do you think we know enough, or do we have enough data that soon enough chatbots would replace talk therapy. Yeah.
So there are already examples of people using, standard AI models to, sort of self-therapize. People who go on and try to, get help from ChatGPT or Claude or whatever the latest model is. People are already kind of doing it. And there is an enormous amount of, commercial interest in developing, therapist AI type models. That is just the next step from, there have been a variety of forms of sort of internet-based therapies that have been available for quite a number of years. People can go onto websites and engage in forms of cognitive therapy where they get instruction and can follow, various tools and so forth. And those things help some people. And I think there will be, artificial intelligence-based therapists that will be very helpful for some people. Do I think they're going to be the answer to everybody? I don't, because there is something, fundamental in the human human connection.
Yeah, that's where we started.
And that is not going to be replaced. Mark Zuckerberg might think that we're all going to have 12 AI friends in the future, and there may be some value in artificial companionship, but do I think that's going to replace the need for real friendship? I don't, and I don't think it's going to replace the need for real human contact in a therapeutic domain either.
Yeah.
Does that mean there won't be a place? No, I think there will be a place. I think the availability. One of the challenges with access to good therapy is cost and time and availability and so forth. And so, access and availability will be important, but it's not going to be everything. That's for sure.
To spend some more time on AI and psychedelics, probably in another session. Before we close, with all your experience over the years, for someone who's struggling in a quiet corner, is low and doesn't see what he can do to fix it or she can do to fix it, what would you say to them? What do you want them to hear?
I think the most profound problem, particularly with depression and variants of depression, is one of the core symptoms of depression is hopelessness. People can't see a way forward. And the most important message that we can give anybody who's struggling with depression is a message of hope. There are lots and lots and lots of things that can help somebody who's depressed. And the first thing is just talking to anybody about that, to begin that journey towards getting that sort of help. So talking to somebody that they care for, that's involved in their life, talking to their GP, ringing Lifeline or the other services that are available locally, and just trying to make some form of connection that can start to have an impact on that hopelessness, because that is the fundamental barrier that a lot of people have to coming forward. And if you remember one thing from this conversation, is when you're experiencing that degree of hopelessness, that is part of the depression. It doesn't necessarily mean it's real. Right. And there are lots and lots of things that can be done to help.
Over the years, you've helped lots of patients, helped heal them, their minds. How has all that experience, work, interaction with your patients, how has that changed your mind or understanding of your mind yourself?
Look, probably lots of different ways, but I think maybe the most important in this context is a recognition that we are all vulnerable. We all go through difficult periods of life, and I'm human like everybody, and in the last couple of years I've faced some really difficult personal circumstances, and I think what I took away from all of those experiences was a very strong sense of having to be very proactive in doing things to maintain my mental well-being and to explore what I found therapeutic, what I needed to maintain my well-being. And so, amongst other things, I find exercising actively in nature is extraordinarily helpful for me. Right. If I go and I can go and sit under a tree, and that might be helpful, but if I go for a vigorous hike and climb a mountain, relatively speaking, a mountain, that will have a profound transformational effect on the way I feel. And so I try to ensure that I build in the sorts of things that I find emotionally sustaining into my life. And if I know I'm struggling or I've got difficult things coming up, to ensure that I do those sorts of things to look after myself. And I think that's learning to find what works for me. I think it's a real gift, and it's a gift that's come from that experience.
Paul, thanks for sharing that, and I hope you keep doing the great work you've been doing over the years. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.